Episode 56, WP, August 7th, 2024. How does your state make electricity? New York Times. RAWSEP View RAWSEP looked at the 50 colored charts of percentage of electricity from an energy source for each of the 50 United States electrical energy in the 22 years from 2001 to 2023. The gray areas on the chart stand for biomass, or wood-burning energy source percentage by each state, and the gray area increases and decreases over time for each individual state. What gray areas of wood-burning as an energy source stand out on the charts? There are the largest gray wood-burning percentages in the charts of the 6 states of California, Hawaii, Idaho, Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. California. Biomass wood-burning use for electricity generation has seemed to decline in California from 6% to 4% from 2001 to 2023. Maine. Biomass wood-burning use for electricity generation has seemed to decline in Maine from 20% to 13% from 2001 to 2023. Vermont. Biomass wood-burning use for electricity generation has seemed to increase in Vermont from 7% to 17% from 2001 to 2023. Smaller gray wood-burning percentage areas are large enough to visibly appear on charts of Arkansas, Connecticut, Florida, Georgia, Indiana, Louisiana, Maryland, Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, Mississippi, Nevada, New Jersey, New York, North Carolina, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, Virginia, Washington, and Wisconsin. There may be biomass burning for energy in the other 50 states, but it may be too small a percentage to be visible on these simple charts. Unfortunately, the word renewable is used for both clean renewables like wind and solar and polluting renewables like biomass wood burning. Excerpts edited by RAWSEP for brevity and clarity in relationship to Residents Against Wood Smoke Emission Particulates of 501c3 nonprofit organization. August 2, 2024. How the United States made electricity from 2001 to 2023. Natural gas surpassed coal as the country's top source of power in 2016, and renewables like wind and solar have grown quickly to become major players in the U.S. power system. But every state has its own story. In Nevada, natural gas became the top source of electricity generation in 2005, earlier than in many other places. More recently, solar power has surged there. Wind has taken off in Iowa over the past 2 decades, beating out coal in 2019 to become the state's largest source of power generation. Even in Wyoming, where coal still dominates, alternative sources of power have made steady gains. Last year, coal was the top electricity fuel in 10 states, down from 32 states in 2001. Natural gas largely took over during that time, but wind also emerged as a leading power source across the Midwest. Switching from coal to natural gas for power produces fewer CO2 emissions than burning coal. But fewer emissions is not the same as zero emissions. President Biden's 2022 Inflation Reduction Act aimed to turbocharge the growth of renewable wind and solar energy nationwide, and to support other technologies that could reduce emissions from the power sector like nuclear energy, advanced batteries, and carbon capture and storage for gas plants. But Republicans promised to repeal many of its clean energy provisions. What happens at the federal level is only part of the equation. States have the power to accelerate, slow down, or block new energy development too. We charted how electricity generation has changed in every state so far from 2001 to 2023 using data from the United States Energy Information Administration. Find your state below. Page 1, Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, Arkansas, California, and Colorado, United States. How California made electricity from 2001 to 2023. Natural gas has been California's top electricity fuel since 2001, but more than half of the power produced in the state last year came from renewable energy and other carbon-free sources, including solar, wind, geothermal, hydro, and nuclear. Solar power in particular has grown rapidly over the past decade, largely because of supportive state policies. At the same time, nuclear power has declined. One of the state's 2 nuclear plants closed in 2012. The other is now slated to retire in 2030. California has often led the way on clean power, using state policy to encourage the adoption of clean power technologies like solar panels and giant grid batteries. In 2018, the state set a goal for utilities to get all of their electricity from zero-carbon sources by 2045. State utilities and regulators are now wrestling with how quickly they can reduce dependence on natural gas while still maintaining a reliable power supply. California consumes more electricity than it generates within its borders, and typically imports about 1/3 to 1/5 of the power it uses. Imports are not reflected in the chart above. Page 2, Connecticut, Florida, Georgia, Hawaii, Idaho, Illinois, Indiana, and Iowa. How Hawaii made electricity from 2001 to 2023. Hawaii has relied heavily on imported oil to make electricity for the past 2 decades. But the state has an ambitious plan to generate all of its power from clean energy sources by 2045. In September 2022, Hawaii shut down its last coal-burning power plant, a major milestone toward that goal. Last year, there was no utility-scale coal generation in Hawaii for the first time since the early 1970s, but delays in the deployment of new solar and battery projects meant oil-fired generation ticked up. The state recently opened a new large-scale battery storage facility as part of its strategy to replace the coal power that was retired. Battery charging and discharging is not shown in the charts above, which reflect net generation. Solar generation, mostly from small-scale rooftop panels, has grown rapidly in the state over the past decade and provided nearly 20% of Hawaii's power last year. In total, about 31% of the state's electricity was made by renewable sources in 2023. How Idaho made electricity from 2001 to 2023. Hydro generated the vast majority of Idaho's electricity during the 2000s and early 2010s. But in recent years, drought conditions have pushed down the amount of hydroelectric power produced in the state. Idaho still makes the majority of its electricity from renewable sources, with hydro providing 43% of in-state power generation last year, and wind and solar together providing an additional 22%. But natural gas power has expanded significantly at the same time. Idaho also imports a sizable amount of power from out of state to meet its electricity needs. In the past, much of this power has come from coal-fired generators in neighboring states, but Oregon closed its last coal plant in 2020, and other nearby coal plants are scheduled to shut down over the next several years. Imports are not shown on the chart. Page 3, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, Michigan, and Minnesota. How Maine made electricity from 2001 to 2023. Most of the electricity generated in Maine last year came from renewable sources. Together, hydroelectric dams, wind turbines, solar arrays, and biomass plants, which burn wood and other organic materials, produced about 69% of the state's power. However, the total amount of power generated in Maine, particularly from natural gas and petroleum, has declined significantly over the last 2 decades. The state now imports between 10 and 30% of its electricity each year from other nearby states and Canada. Imports are not shown on the chart above. Maine has a goal of getting 100% of its electricity from renewable sources by 2050. Page 4. Mississippi, Missouri, Montana, Nebraska, Nevada, New Hampshire, New Jersey, and New Mexico. How New Hampshire made electricity from 2001 to 2023. The bulk of electricity generated in New Hampshire over the past 2 decades has come from the state's only nuclear reactor, Seabrook Station. Natural gas has been the state's second largest source of power since the early 2000s when 2 new generating stations went online. The share of electricity supplied by coal has declined over the past 2 decades, shrinking to about 1% in 2023 from 25% in 2001. New Hampshire currently generates about 16% of its electricity from renewable sources, mostly hydro and biomass, a type of energy that comes from burning wood and other organic matter. The state requires utilities to get 25% of the power they sell to customers from renewable sources by 2025, a target they can fulfill by purchasing renewable energy credits. New Hampshire produces more power than it consumes and sends the excess to other New England states and Canada. Exports are not shown on the chart above. Page 5. New York, North Carolina, North Dakota, Ohio, Oklahoma, Oregon, Pennsylvania, and Rhode Island. How Oregon made electricity from 2001 to 2023. Most of the electricity produced in Oregon in any given year comes from hydroelectric dams, but the exact amount can fluctuate depending on precipitation. Power from natural gas typically increases during drought years and decreases in years with ample rain and snow. Over the past decade, wind has grown to become the third largest source of electricity generated in the state. In an effort to encourage more non-hydroelectric renewable power, Oregon requires its large investor-owned utilities to get 50% of the electricity they sell to customers from new renewable energy sources by 2040. Other utilities are subject to lower standards. In most years, Oregon exports some of its power to nearby states. Exports are not included in the chart above. Page 6. South Carolina, South Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, Vermont, Virginia, Washington, West Virginia, Wisconsin, and Wyoming. How Vermont made electricity from 2001 to 2023. Most of the electricity generated in Vermont came from nuclear power until 2014, when the state's only nuclear plant, Vermont Yankee, closed down. Since then, virtually all of the electricity produced in the state has come from renewable sources, including hydropower, biomass, wind, and solar. But Vermont now generates much less electricity in total than it did before the nuclear plant shut down, and has to import a substantial amount of power from other New England states and Canada to satisfy demand. Imports are not shown on the chart above. Vermont recently strengthened its renewable energy standard to require that 100% of electricity sold in the state come from renewable sources by 2035. United States Electricity Profile 2022. Name average retail price, cents/kilowatt-hour. Alabama, 11.59. Alaska, 20.73. Arizona, 11.31. Arkansas, 9.91. California, 22.33. Colorado, 11.75. Connecticut, 21.08. Delaware, 11.83. District of Columbia, 14.94. Florida, 12.51. Georgia, 12.00. Hawaii, 39.72. Idaho, 8.51. Illinois, 11.94. Indiana, 11.66. Iowa, 9.57. Kansas, 11.47. Kentucky, 10.51. Louisiana, 10.41. Maine, 17.44. Maryland, 13.32. Massachusetts, 21.27. Michigan, 13.20. Minnesota, 12.04. Mississippi, 10.36. Missouri, 10.26. Montana, 9.97. Nebraska, 8.83. Nevada, 10.94. New Hampshire, 21.07. New Jersey, 14.80. New Mexico, 10.02. New York, 18.33. North Carolina, 9.60. North Dakota, 8.42. Ohio, 10.64. Oklahoma, 10.05. Oregon, 9.26. Pennsylvania, 11.86. Rhode Island, 19.30. South Carolina, 10.74. South Dakota, 10.44. Tennessee, 10.89. Texas, 10.16. Utah, 8.80. Vermont, 16.99. Virginia, 10.75. Washington, 9.05. West Virginia, 9.74. Wisconsin, 11.95. Wyoming, 8.24.